Greetings, how are you? This is Kinesiology 236. We're going to be talking specifically about Chapter 8, Hip Joint and Pelvic Girdle. To that end, when you look at this video, actually I'll end up breaking this out into two segments because the amount of content that was in Chapter 8 was pretty in-depth. And there's a lot that goes on across the hip joint and the pelvic girdle. And really, when you think about it, you look at the pelvis itself. I mean, it's a super stable joint. There's a lot going on within the pelvis. And really just kind of think this through. Everything from north of the border attaches south of the border, and south of the border, north of the border, across the pelvis. And when you look at any type of locomotion or movement in the human body, or playing a sport or any activity, the pelvis and the musculature that crosses the hip joints is pretty darn important. So this area of the body has a lot going on, and there's a lot of content in this chapter, although it didn't seem like it when you first started digging in, but it is a pretty juicy chapter. So this will end up being two videos, more than likely. Now, the actual joint itself, you have the head of the femur connects into the acetabulum of the pelvis. And the pelvic girdle has three different bones that all tie together. And the femur itself, it's a load-bearing bone, carries a lot of weight, and it fits into the head of the femur fits into the acetabulum, and you know that it's an endothelial joint because it's a ball and socket style joint. Now, don't confuse this. And I brought this up the other lecture. Don't confuse this joint with the shoulder joint in terms of complexity, in terms of strength, and in terms of what goes on across the joint, because they are different. All right. So in this, out of this list on the right are all the different landmarks that are given. These are the biggies. Know the sacrum, know the ilium, the sacroiliac joints, the acetabulum, the coccyx, the obturator foramen, symphysis pubis, femur, greater and lesser trochanter. Because of these, to a lesser degree, you'll also need to know iliac crest as well. But for all of these, when you look at this, many are landmarks, many help you orient yourself when it comes to the pelvis, but also it helps you when you're working with clients and you have to get your hands on clients to be able to kind of palpate where things are in the body. So if we go through this, you have the sacrum, right? I often describe the sacrum and the ilium, these two ears out on the side. When I talk with clients, I describe this as kind of like a tongue and groove view to it. And by that, I mean you have the two ears of the ilium, one on each side, and the base of the sacrum fits kind of like a tongue into the two grooves provided by the ilium. Now, where this becomes important is this is the foundation for the building blocks above it that comprise our spinal column. So if you have any kind of dysfunction, some type of SI function, sacroiliac function, commonly referred to as SI dysfunction, in this joint, it will translate up into the spinal column. When you look a little bit further, you have the sacroiliac joint, that's these guys right here, like I just mentioned. Acetabulum, the acetabulum is where the head of the femur fits into the ilium itself. The coccyx, your tailbone. The obturator foramen, these two little eyes right here. And you have the symphysis pubis. You kind of tie this down in here where you have right and left side come together. That's a fusion. The femur, the long bone, and the greater and lesser trochanter. So the greater is the top side, and the lesser is the inferior, but it's also more medial. So keep that in mind when you have greater and lesser. Greater is lateral, lesser is more medial. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and just kind of breeze through some of these. Some of these you can figure out and you can read through this. I don't need to read from these slides. And also I need to save some time here. And this is a pretty good representation of how you have the head of the femur kind of pulled away and it fits into the acetabulum. And you have this labrum that goes around the acetabulum itself that helps hold the head in place. It's a pretty darn strong joint, and you have a pretty strong ligament architecture in there, and it's pretty solid in being able to hold everything together. If you dislocate a hip, it's a pretty serious injury, no doubt about it. I'm going to go ahead and just buzz through this because you know what type of joint it is, you know how it fits in, you know what I just mentioned here about the ligaments. And they put this picture in the book, and I left it in here for your benefit. It's okay to know some of these things. I don't believe I'm going to have too many questions on this once we get into quiz time. But with the joint and the ligaments themselves, notice this. Notice how when you come out to the greater trochanter and how the ischiofemoral ligament comes out and actually rotates to a more superior position, and the iliofemoral ligament comes out and goes a little bit more behind it. See that? Just want to point that out for your benefit. So when you think of, like I mentioned before, that dish rag example, and you're talking about rotating and running, what's going to happen in that joint itself with the articulation of the joint. What I like about this is they talk about the different components of, if you do pelvic rotation, you're going to have some lumbar extension, you're going to have some hip flexion, and you're going to have some hip flexion. So I like this in terms of how it breaks out right side, left side. And this is actually be good for you later on. And we've seen some of this actually before as well. In one of our lectures regarding sprinting, we talked about how the pelvis actually rotates anterior, posterior, but also rotates about a transverse plane. This I thought was really good in the book. I like how they used the steering wheel example. And when you look at anterior, posterior pelvic tilt, you can even do this, right? If you stand up and you put your fingertips on your hips, almost like where the elastic is on your shorts or your pants, if you go ahead and as you're standing there, you'll notice your index finger and your thumb, as you put your hands on your hips, will be just about the same height. When you go into anterior tilt or posterior tilt, notice what happens. The fingertip versus thumb relationship will change. So as you go ahead and go into anterior pelvic tilt, the index finger will drop, the thumb will go up, but notice what happens, what translates further up the kinetic chain into the spine. I mentioned the building blocks that are the spine stack on top of the sacrum, and as you tilt the pelvis, what has to happen is that translates into a greater lordotic arch. So often I see people who are big cyclists and big into doing spin classes, and you'll see them waddling around like a duck because what they've done is they've shortened the musculature in the front side of their body, and it's causing anterior pelvic tilt. And that anterior pelvic tilt is translating up into the lumbar region of the spine. I also like this when I talk about right and lateral rotation, but this is also pretty good in terms of a steering wheel and rotating back and forth. I remember I had one dancer who had to have a labrum repaired on her hip, and I had to literally just work on standing in front of her and holding her hips, and she worked on trying to rotate against manual resistance of my hands on her hips. It was kind of neat to work with her in a static environment and kind of work on her being able to jump and turn as a dancer once again, because she could not do anything load bearing. We could not have her do squats, we could not have her do any kind of plyometric work or lunges at all. So we worked on hip mobility and stability first through manual resistance. Got it? Horizontal movement, transverse plane. It's a good example of like where I have my hands on that dancer's hips, rotating pelvis clockwise or counterclockwise. Now, hip flexion. So what I want you to pay attention to in this little GIF here is notice as she's raising her knee and going into hip flexion, and she's going from 180, 90, past 90 into probably about maybe 60 to 70 degrees. Notice what translates up in here. You have a very, very strong interrelated relationship between low back, hamstring complex, and hip flexor complex. And you often find that these three all run in the same party together to cause low back issues. So with hip extension, same thing. Notice the counter movement here, right? She's extending the hip, but there's a counter movement up here. Again, very difficult to try to do this and stay stable and not have any counter movement. Same thing with hip abduction. As you're bringing the leg away, there's a weight transfer, and that weight transfer goes from probably the second digit of the foot, right? Second metatarsal, out to like the fourth or fifth metatarsal because there's a weight transfer because you have a longer lever out away from the central line of the body. Now coming across, you have adduction, and you're trying to do adduction on frontal plane, but notice with this adduction on frontal plane, you end up with transverse plane movement up in the hips. You almost can't do straight adduction or abduction without having some type of counter movement. Internal, external rotation. What's quirky about this is when you externally rotate the hip, notice what happens to the foot. It comes across the midline of the body behind the person. So where it gets kind of confusing sometimes is when you think external rotation, notice what's happening down here. You're going to the medial side of the body. Boom, boom. Same thing with internal rotation. You're rotating inward using the muscles up in the hip to rotate inward, but the foot goes outward. We'll go diagonal abduction. I'll put that up there real quick so you can see it for a second. Adduction. A little bit of the same translation up in here in terms of hip rotation. All right, so this is what I was talking about in terms of anterior pelvic tilt. When you have an anterior pelvic tilt, so often I'll see people walk out of a cycle class with their butt sticking back looking like a duck. Well, what happens is they're in this crunched over position cycling. These get tight, the musculature up front, and it causes pelvic tilt. We played around with this a little bit in class in terms of laying flat on a bench, and I was laying flat on a table, and I was able to flatten out my back by tilting my pelvis. Realize that translates standing, lying position, lying supine, lying prone, and this allows you to have a better imprint when you're lying flat on your back. This allows you to translate up to a more natural spinal position. Again, your building blocks are stacked on the sacrum. Same thing with this, right? When you look at people walking around, they get a little bit older, they get a little bit tighter. Notice what happens in here. You have the pelvic tilt, and again, hamstrings, hip flexors, and low back issues tend to run together. But notice how this translates up, right? You have the pelvic tilt. The pelvic tilt translates into a change of curvature in the back, right? Lower dotic arch. Lower dotic arch is still there, but less pronounced. And they have more kyphosis. There's more rounding up here in the thoracic region of the spine, whereas in a previous slide, it's not there. So this is your foundation. The building blocks all tie into that, and everything ties into those building blocks. So it's important to have a good idea of hip awareness, good structure, good function, good mobility, and good strength. So I'm going to pause this in here because this is going to take a couple minutes. I'm going to start the next video at this point. Actually, I'm back. I have about 2.5 minutes. I think I can get this done. So when you have clients who are like golf centric, they're focused on golf, you'll see them performing this dual action pulley torso rotation, like low to high or even high to low, to try to replicate a golf swing. And it's close, but it's not close enough. So when you look at it, and you look at what they're trying to do, they're really trying to work on this hip mobility and hip rotation up in here, and they're not segmenting. What they're doing is they're working total body, and they're rotating across the plane, which is not bad, but just realize with golf, there's a segmenting process that is involved where the hips have to engage to bring the club around. So now if we go ahead and bring this to the next slide, this is what we just looked at, the segmentation of the hips. And I want you to just take note of this. Now watch, and if you watch the belt line, you'll see the hip will come around first. And there's a really good example of this when you get about 1.5 minutes in. Let's see if I can pull it right now while we're watching this video. If you watch this gentleman in the gray shorts, watch the hips lead. The hips will lead, they rotate, and then the club comes through. So for clients, when they're working on hips and they're working on hands, and I don't care if it's golf, if it's baseball, if you're swinging an implement, you have to think in terms of segmentation. And segmentation lends itself to a much more refined ability to swing a club or swing a bat. The hips lead the charge. This guy does a really good job, if I remember correctly. The hips lead the charge, and then the club follows through. So when your clients are doing the other version of a torso rotation, it's not bad, but they can actually be more precise by teaching a segmentation as a whole part, whole technique, and teach the hips to engage first, and then let the body follow. And then you can have your golf pro work on those other segments to tie it all together. But in terms of straight power and mobility, it's hips first. Absolutely. All right, I'll let this one play out. You got another 30 seconds here. So you can see this gentleman. Oh, look at that position. Very nice. And in the blue and the gray, you'll see him swing through. Hips come around. Ooh, I got 10 seconds. Come on, buddy. Pulls through and